session, please make sure you see the folks at the oak table as you exit, if you're looking for more information about that. Those green session feedback cards are going to be essential for the future conferences and making sure they're valuable to folks. So please make sure you submit them either to me at the end of the session or take them to the oak table at some point before you leave. We're here today to talk about corralling high tunnel arthropod pests through IPM. Our speaker is going to be Dr. Jonathan Larson. He's an extension professor for University of Kentucky who provides insect expertise for people dealing with issues in urban landscapes, turf grasses, nursery crops, greenhouses, or households. He teaches across a variety of platforms using social media, videos, and traditional extension publications. He's one of the co-hosts of Arthropod, an entomology podcast. And as he said to me, he is the bug man. So, it over to him. Thank you all.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invite to be a part of today's meeting. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about arthropod pests in high tunnels, and we're going to be talking very extensively about integrated pest management. I'm also going to reframe it a little bit as PAMs. Some of you may have heard of PAMs before, but we're going to be talking about sort of a sequential order, an order of operations to use when dealing with bugs. I'm hopeful that there will be some tools and tricks that you can use when you go back home and maybe help you to make plans here in 2023. And I know that these things harry you. I get a lot of samples from across the state, and they are always challenging, it sounds like, when we're dealing with our arthropod pests. Insect pests outdoors are, of course, a big deal, but when we talk about greenhouses and high tunnels, they become even more optimized. They really like these spaces because it provides them some level of protection. It also optimizes their short life cycles. So pests, they want to get through things very quickly. It's one of the reasons they are so bad for our crops when they're outside. But when you have optimized conditions inside, perfect heat, perfect humidity, there's nobody there that's going to eat you. They're going to take advantage of that just as well as the plants, and they're going to start taking over and feeding on everything. In terms of why they like it, it is a lot to do with that heat, the consistent heat. Insects don't like it when they get cold. They're what we call poikiliothermic. You can break that out at your next party. That's a fancy $2 way of saying that they are cold-blooded, sort of. They are the same temperature as whatever surrounds them. So if an insect is exposed to the temperatures we have today, they would be quite cold. They may not freeze to death. It takes them an extended period to suffer that kind of fate. But when they get into a high tunnel or into a greenhouse, of course, it's a lot balmier in there, and you get these weird life cycles. Outside, everything is generally predicted by what we call growing degree days, how everything progresses. Inside of a high tunnel, that's all kind of thrown out the window because the degree days are accumulating differently, and so we have to be very sort of aware of what these bugs are doing when they get in there. They're also really good at recovering from insecticide applications, both organic and non-organic options when you are treating inside of the tunnels. And so there's some of them left behind to breed, and then we end up with possible insecticide resistance issues as well. So when we're talking about high tunnels, I always joke with my friends that we do these high tunnel publications with, it's the best of both worlds and the worst of both worlds when we're talking about pests. The field, you get a lot of bugs that are coming in from all over, you get consistent pressure, but with high tunnels you have this idea that you're building a force field. Unfortunately, that's not quite true, because once they get in there, they're going to take really good advantage of it. And we see with some research from places like Purdue that they thrive better in the high tunnel. The tomato hornworms in particular, it seems like once they get into the tunnel, the wasps that lay their eggs in them and other things, they can't find them anymore, and so you get these huge booms in population. That was deadly. I almost fell right in front of all of you. So this is a very unique pest management situation, very challenging. It takes a lot of effort on your all's part if you're going to use high tunnels, and it doesn't have a huge research focus nationally. We do see some programs being built around high tunnel research for arthropod pests, but right now it's sort of getting built up. It isn't at the level that it is for field agriculture. When we talk about that insecticide resistance that I just mentioned before, the pests that are left behind if you don't kill them, sometimes they are maybe immune to the products that we use, and they're able to further take advantage of that high tunnel environment. and nothing else is going to kill them and wipe them out. So they're going to get to breed and pass on those resistant genetics, and we end up with more problems in the future because the products that we like to use no longer work. And you already, with organic ag, have an increased sort of presence of organic insecticides. You have to apply more frequently anyway. And so with that, paired with the fact that they can survive better in the high tunnel, we see that resistance pop up more and more. So these are all the reasons that we're kind of worried about these pests. Of course, the damage that they incur as well. And we want to have some sort of plan to deal with them. And in my role, I like to talk a lot about integrated pest management. This past semester, I got put in charge of teaching our course on integrated pest management. It was an asynchronous course for our students, so it was all online. I never met a single one of my students. It was kind of awkward, but they seemed to like it at the end at least. And so what we went through in that course was what we see here in this pyramid. This is sort of the classical conception of integrated pest management. I'm hopeful that you've all heard the term IPM at least a few times in your journey in agriculture, but this is something that's been around sort of officially since the 1970s. Actually, President Richard Nixon was the first federal employee to write a definition of IPM, a fact I find astounding. He did it in the same year that he did Watergate, so he was very busy that year, very busy that year. He came up with this federal definition, or somebody that worked for him did, but that was when we started to federally recognize what IPM is. And it's this idea that all of these kinds of tactics can be used against pest populations, that we have a whole smattering of tools at our disposal, starting with cultural control down here at the bottom, and we've got monitoring, physical, mechanical control, biological and chemical control as well. In the classic way that we present this, we often use this sort of food pyramid structure that you see here, trying to imply that cultural methods should be first and foremost. They're the base of the pyramid. Then you have monitoring and these other things getting smaller and smaller until you get to the top, implying that chemical control should be used the least often. So this is great. This is the way we've done it for a long time. I like talking about IPM. I do find that a lot of people don't know about IPM, or they have a different definition of it in their head. A lot of people, when I start talking about it, they say, oh, you're talking about organic. And I'm like, no, it's not quite organic. It uses insecticides, synthetic products. It's just a more judicious use of them rather than the Clint Eastwood approach that everybody seems to use nowadays. Spray them all, let God sort it out. Just get the can of Raid and get rid of them. So it's not organic. It's not that traditional approach. It's kind of wedged in the middle. It's recognition that there's all these other tools, and used at its highest potential, it will help to protect the environment, it'll protect workers, and it will reduce pest pressure. So that's what we're hoping for with this. I have been trying to change the view of it a little bit. When I speak about it, there was somebody I talked to once that presented it as a tool belt, and I actually prefer that over the pyramid concept, because I think that this shows you kind of more what we're dealing with. So the pyramid, it sort of prejudices you against some of the different methods off the bat, but really every tool should be in your tool belt. If you have a screw in front of you that you need to handle, you don't get out the pipe wrench, right? You don't use a hammer for trying to fix something necessarily. We want to use the right tool in the right situation, and all of the different things that I talked about are tools that are on the table. And that as we go through them today, that's kind of what I'm going to refer to them as tools. The other thing that we are doing more with IPM is sort of repackaging it as PAMs. Is anybody named Pam? No? Okay, good. This won't be awkward then. So the PAMs approach, if you ever do NRCS work, if you ever have some NRCS funding, you may have heard of PAMs before, but PAMs is kind of this modern look at integrated pest management, taking a lot of the things that I've been talking about and just sort of recontextualizing them into a more sequential order. Because when you think of that tool belt, it can be a little daunting. This is more of an idea that you can take these, and there's an order of operations that we're going to proceed through with each of these to hopefully prevent the pest problem. So we've been teaching about these methods for decades. Some people don't like PAMs. I was a little prejudiced against it, first and foremost because I thought it was a missed opportunity to call it spam. They didn't seem to see that one. But other people feel that it's just sort of a rejiggering, right? Like it's just taking the same things and giving them different names. And that's true, but if it helps people to learn it more easily, I think that that's maybe something we should support. So we'll talk about it all today. We'll talk about PAMs, we'll talk about it as IPM, and hopefully one of the two will work for you, and you'll be able to implement it as we go forward. But in PAMs, we have recontextualized these things into these 4 words. The first one is prevention. So this is from a Michigan State publication. If you want to follow that link, if you want to take pictures of any of the slides so that you can have them when you go home, I highly encourage you to do that. But basically, you're supposed to prevent the pests from ever entering the tunnel or ever entering the field, which is a really good idea in concept, right? We like the idea that we can prevent this, we can stop it from happening, and that this should be the first line of defense. Further, we have A, which is avoidance. Avoidance is a lot like prevention, but it also is sort of recognizing the reality that pests are everywhere, that they are impossible to prevent in reality, and so we have to avoid them when we can. Altering cultural methods in particular to try and avoid having their populations build up into high enough levels that they become a problem. So that's prevention, avoidance. The M stands for monitoring. Monitoring is sort of the foundation, I think, on which all of this hinges, because if you're not monitoring, you don't actually know if you've prevented them, you don't know if you've actually avoided them, and you definitely aren't going to know when they have found a sweet spot in your high tunnel and they're breeding like crazy, and then you're going to have a problem. So you have to be out there looking for them. In my world, that means doing all kinds of monitoring tips and tricks, either getting on your hands and knees and looking at plants, or putting out yellow bull traps, like if you're trying to catch squash vine borer. If you've ever dealt with those in the field, if you put a yellow plastic bowl out with soapy water in it, they think it's a super stressed plant, and the females will fly right into it. And once you start seeing them in there, you know that it's time to either cover up those pumpkins or put some insecticide at the base of them. But if you're not monitoring for it, you'll miss them. The other things, the pathologists and the weed scientists of the world would talk about weather monitoring as well as soil testing, things of that nature. But I'm not going to talk about that because bugs are way cooler than both of those problems. So the last thing we want to talk about is suppression. Suppression is when we admit, okay, they're here, they've infested an area, now we have to do something about it. And the word suppression is picked because in a lot of cases we talk about management, some people talk about control, other people may talk about eradication, but really the goal should be suppression. You're never going to get rid of all of them, particularly in an organic situation. So how can you suppress them to a point that they no longer are a problem for you? And there's going to be 4 main tactics that we can use, either cultural, physical, biological, or chemical control. And historically, those have been the categories, but now they've been kind of folded in to this suppression. Everything copacetic so far? We're all on the same page? Excellent. So as we talk about high tunnels, we talk about IPM, we talk about PAMs. Like I've been saying, this is a more sequential feel. So how are you going to prevent pests from getting in there? How are you going to avoid problems with pests and then monitor for them? And then how are you going to suppress them? When I first met high tunnels, I was like, this has got to be the greatest thing in the world, right? Like it's a plastic tunnel, bugs probably don't want to live in there. And then you walk in, you're like, it's like 40 degrees hotter in here. They can't possibly survive. This is great. And then you start looking around, you're like, no, they're doing wonderful. This is awesome for them. There's aphids everywhere. So it's very comfortable work for me. I know there's always going to be something to talk about. When we talk about prevention, the big thing with high tunnels is going to be preventing them from coming in when you're introducing stock. So if you're buying starters, if you have starters that you've had growing elsewhere, there's probably pests on them. This is a big problem that I've encountered. I've done several Amish farm visits, and when they've bought from others or had presents from others, they come with hitchhikers, a lot of aphids in the early part of the year. So checking those plants and making sure you're not importing problems, and then possibly even quarantining these new plants if you have some space for that. I know quarantine is a bit of a buzzword in the last 3 years, but you can have an area sort of separate, maybe slightly protected or slightly squared off, where you can put new plants and watch them more closely. You could just have more direct monitoring on those plants for a set period of time until you feel they've kind of been integrated into the high tunnel. But you definitely want to be paying close attention to them and making sure you're not bringing problems in. After that, we can do things to prevent pests by altering some of our cultural methods. A big one is irrigation. Irrigation can create issues with pathology. It can create issues with entomology. So you have water coming down, or you have water in the soil getting pushed out, or you're going through and watering yourself. That moisture, you don't want to overwater, of course. You don't want it to linger because then things could flourish because of it. So if you reduce the amount of irrigation, or change the time that you do it so that it's going to get absorbed by the plants, then you could cut down on issues with things like the fungus gnats. Their maggots prefer a very damp environment. This is them here, dark-winged fungus gnat larvae. They have very interesting biology. They love to feed on fungi down in the soil, but they will sometimes be like, oh, that looks like a tasty plant root, and they'll nibble on that. The adults can also vector pathogens throughout greenhouses and high tunnels. They also do this weird behavior where they will emerge in mass, and they glom together, and they look like a snake, and they will crawl away. So I get a lot of panicked calls about alien snakes in people's greenhouses and high tunnels, and then they pick them apart, and it's dozens of little snakes. It's a lot of fun to be like, no, those are actually maggots that you're touching. People really like to have that kind of input. But if you have too much moisture, then they're going to be more successful. If you're following proper irrigation practices, hopefully not overwatering, then they won't be as healthy. And we can also just restrict our watering. If it's feasible to do so that your plants won't die, you can dry these out. One monitoring tip for these that I can throw out real quick is also potato slices. They like potatoes. If you slice them up and put them on top of the soil, you can walk along and flip them over, and the maggots will be stuck in there feeding, and you can check and see if you have a problem that's kind of brewing. Other things can include sanitation. Sanitation has a big role in prevention and preventing establishment. This is because you want to get rid of things that they could be using. The big factor in sanitation, I think, is getting rid of overwintering habitat. How many of you go in your tunnel in the fall and you take everything out? It's a blank slate as you go in. See some hands raised. If you leave anything behind, that's going to be spots where eggs are, where pupa are, and even some adults are going to be hiding out in that, and they're going to have a step up on their competition in the spring because it'll be warmer in there. They'll get started earlier, and you just have sort of forced those pests on yourself in the next calendar year. You can also get rid of infested plants. Don't just throw them in a trash can that then sits in the high tunnel because they'll fly out and go back on the other plants. You want to get rid of them entirely, and you want to clean equipment and people, actually. This is one that not everybody seems to consider, but pest problems like thrips, they have a preference for certain colors. They like white, blue, and yellow. They would be Morehead State fans if they lived in Kentucky, I believe. So they have all these colors that they are visibly attracted to. They like them. And when we wear these colors as our shirts, they will fly to people and they will land on you. And then you can be transmitting thrips as you walk around into your various high tunnels. Thrips also have a problem with landing on people and being like, what is this weird squishy thing? It is not a plant. And then they will bite you. And it's not a very pleasant sensation. It feels like a little pinprick. Thrips have weird mouths. They're asymmetrical. Half of it is a rasper, so it's like a file. So they kind of like sand your skin with that side. And then the other side is like a piercing, sucking mouth part, so like a needle. So then they stab you with that. So it's a sand and a stab. That's how they work. And it's not very good for your skin when that happens. So you don't want to be wearing these kinds of colors if you're dealing with a thrips problem in one tunnel. Otherwise, you could be moving it to your other tunnels if you have multiple ones. Another route of sanitation is getting rid of alternate hosts. I was in a high tunnel last spring, and this gentleman that I was talking with, his extension agent had me come out, and when we were walking around, he was like, I get aphids in this tunnel every year. It was late February when I visited. It starts now. I just don't understand what's happening. He's like, he had this cool robot thing, and it went over the top of the plants, and it treated all of the plants that he wanted to protect. It was a really high-tech system. And I said, well, what about this strip in the middle? We were walking on this sort of clay, gravel strip, and it was covered in plants. It was all annual bluegrass. And I was like, do these ever get treated? And he said, oh, no, this is just weeds and stuff. Like, I don't bother with this. And I took him down on our hands and knees, and I was like, well, this is where they're coming from. These turf plants were completely covered with little tiny aphids. And so he would go through and blast them off all of these other plants with a heavy-duty insecticide, and then leave these banks of them behind in other spots. And they just were like, wait out the residues on the plants and then move right back on. So we have to think about these other places that they can live, and weeds are a big part of that. Any weed that encroaches is a green bridge to bring things like aphids and other pests into the high tunnel. Then we have to talk about avoidance. And avoidance is, like I said, a little bit similar to prevention, but it is more focused on cultural methods and trying to avoid letting pests reach what we call the economic injury level, this threshold that we have problems at. A big thing with avoidance is going to be choosing resistant cultivars, plants that can sort of resist the insects getting on them. I know my example here is some grapes, and you're probably not growing grapes in high tunnels, hopefully, but it is a good example of resistance to this problem on the leaves and on the grapes that you see here. It's not a total eradication. It doesn't mean that they're invincible. You could still get issues on these plants, but hopefully we're keeping them below this injury level, and I'll talk more about that here in a few minutes. Beyond cultivars, you can also try to do more rotation. Rotation helps to sort of break the cycle with pests. We have a lot of high tunnels in the state that it's just tomato, tomato, tomato every year as far as they grow. So you can try to break the tomato pest life cycle by introducing another crop that the tomato pest may not preferentially feed on, and then put tomatoes back in the next year, and hopefully you'll have broken some of those pests and they won't come back as easily. You do have to monitor for that though. We have a publication on this, CCDFS23, very catchy title, to learn about a rotation project that's been going on at the University of Kentucky. It's about tomatoes and cut flowers being used kind of in conjunction so that you can hopefully see fewer pests on both of them. It has a lot of other elements to it, including economic analysis, some pathological analysis. But like I said, I worry about the bugs first and foremost. So we're trying to snap those pests by introducing different food that they don't want to feed on. And then avoiding pests on the calendar is another strategy to think about. The earlier you go out, the less likely you are to have pests on those plants when they are susceptible. You can maybe get the plants up and strong before the pests start to move in. It can be tricky in a high tunnel because if you're able to go out and start planting and growing, the pests that are in there or that may be introduced in there are also going to be kind of up and running. But we do see that we avoid them at the end of the year where the pests kind of peter out by August, and then whatever plants we put in, if you can get them growing and then harvest them by November, that's what we've done with the cut flowers, we see a great reduction in a lot of the pest pressure by avoiding these things on the calendar. So just another kind of cultural method to keep in mind. And then all of this hinges on making sure that you're monitoring. If you're not checking for the pests, then you're not going to be able to make sure that these first couple of strategies have worked, and you're not going to know if they are breeding up on you and going to pop up and create an issue. So we have to be out there and looking for them. The ways that we do this are various, and I'll go through those here in a second. But the goal here is to catch the early bird gets the worm, right? You want to catch the pest population before it's had a chance to breed to high levels. The higher the number of pests we have, the harder they are to get rid of. You can also find them when they're at their weakest. Insects have various parts in their life cycle where they're more susceptible to our strategies. Insects developed through, is this the laser? No, that's not the laser. Oh, that's okay. I'll just point. When we have insects, we have two different ways that we develop. There's complete metamorphosis and then incomplete metamorphosis. With complete metamorphosis, you have an egg. The egg hatches and you get a larva. The larva looks very different than the adult. If we have a moth larva here, we would call it a caterpillar. There's a pupal stage in between. The eggs and larval stages here are very difficult to do a lot about. They're not feeding, they're not moving, they have a thick layer of protection. Adults feed in a very different way, so it's hard to control them. We want to get those caterpillars, and we want to get them when they're smaller. In entomology, it's very morbid. You're always going after the smallest and the weakest. We're bullies like that. You kill the children in a very macabre way in entomology. If you look at the aphid over here, we have an egg, and then we have nymphs. The nymphs look very similar to the adult and behave very similar. Again, we want to get those nymphs when they're smaller. The bigger they get, the more likely they are to detoxify some of the pesticides that we put out, and the harder they are to kill. So we want to try and catch them early on. The other thing is we hit sort of an exponential growth phase where the pests just keep going, and then you can't do a lot of these prevention and avoidance strategies anymore, and your only recourse is going to be spraying something. You, in a high tunnel, can use anything that's labeled for greenhouses in Kentucky, in the insecticide world, but with the organic layer added on top of that, your list starts getting smaller and smaller when you're doing organic production in a high tunnel. So you'll have a smaller list than whatever this guy had before he put on that Tyvek suit and went in there, but you will have some options, and I'll talk more about those when we get to the end. So in terms of monitoring in the tunnel, you want to have some active sampling. where you're actually in there and looking at the plants. You'll want to get some optical enhancement gear, so hand lenses, a magnifying glass, put on your best Sherlock Holmes hat, and then get your magnifying glass and get out there and start looking. Get a cool cowboy hat and do it, like this lady here. But you just want to focus your attention on the plants. And I'm not telling you that you have to go and check every plant. You can have set plants in each row that you pick. You can divide the high tunnel into regions. You could have row A, column 1, that you would say, okay, this plant needs checked here, and then do one in the next column and row, and make sure that you're doing a little bit of monitoring in each section. You'll want to check higher risk plants or more high dollar plants more frequently, and this just is a way of getting out there and looking for them. So you'll want to be flipping leaves over, taking a close look at the bottom side, taking a look at fruits, taking a look at flowers and buds. Insect pests have learned it's very good to be on the bottom side of the leaf because the humans go by and look at the top and say, oh, there's nobody there. So we're on the underside and we've tricked them. So flip it over and look for them. You will see them crawling around. We have signs and symptoms. Signs are the insects themselves. Symptoms are the things that they leave behind, the evidence that they leave. So here we have some aphids crawling around, but we've also got aphid exuvia, old skins left behind. If it ever looks like your leaves have all these weird popcorn holes left on them, it's probably an aphid population that's been booming there. If you see wilted leaves, all these different symptoms, then we can start talking about possible culprits. This is how we do a lot of identification. It's backwards in entomology. Somebody brings you a curled, gnarled leaf that's very sticky. That's probably aphid damage. It's covered in honeydew that they've been feeding on and pooping out, and now you got all this sticky butt juice on your hand and on your plant, and you use that to figure out who you're dealing with. We've also got stippling for things like spider mites. All of this can be very diagnostic, and you'll find these kinds of symptoms are used in books like Garden Insects of North America by Whitney Cranshaw. He divides everybody up by the symptoms that they leave behind because it's an easier way of doing ID. Another way that you can do some direct monitoring is kind of catching pests. If you're an entomologist, you put a pith helmet on, you get a big sweep net, and you go busting around through the woods and you catch whatever you want. But if you're trying to preserve the plants, unlike me, I go into the woods and I shake it on down, right? Like I want to bust things up and get the bugs. You want to keep your tomato whole and healthy, so you don't want to get a net and sweep through there. Get a beat sheet instead. Take just a small piece of white paper, go to each plant that you're monitoring and tap the susceptible areas, and then look at the white paper and see if anybody's crawling around. Then you can squish them and curse them down to Hades if you want. Otherwise, you can collect them and sample for them and figure out who you're dealing with. But that all requires you to be there, physically in the tunnel, sort of collecting these things. You want some passive sampling to be going on when you're not there. And in your world, if you're doing high tunnels, the best option for that is going to be our sticky card traps. Sticky cards come in index card size for the most part. I'm guessing many of you have used them before, but when we install these, they're there 24/7, hopefully providing some monitoring for you even when you're not there. This is going to be very helpful in the long run, but only if you look at them. I have seen many fossilized yellow sticky cards in my time, where you walk into a tunnel and it's clear it was put up there in the Clinton administration and forgotten about. So you got to get them down, you got to check them on a weekly or every other weekly basis, and look at what's on there. Otherwise, it's not really helpful.
Do beneficial insects ever get attracted to those as well?
There are. So her question was, do beneficial or non-target organisms get attracted to the sticky cards? The unfortunate answer is yes, that there are some bycatches. You will see occasionally skipper butterflies on these. We see houseflies get stuck to them. I don't see a lot of the beneficial insects like lady beetles and others get directly stuck on these, but there are some non-target things that are attracted to the same colors, so you do get some bycatch. It's a good question.
Because once they're stuck to that, it's really hard to identify what it is, because now it's like destroyed itself and almost smeared on the thing.
So a point that she brought up, I just have to repeat it because they're recording it, is that when things get stuck to it, they flop around and they panic, and then they kind of destroy parts of their body. That is very true. It can be difficult to do a lot of identification. I would share. I'm actually working on making a sticky card guide where I'm taking pictures of things that I've identified after they've been mangled and destroyed, so that hopefully it can be more helpful. But yes, once they're on there, it can be tricky to identify some of them, but the hope is that you've caught enough that you can get kind of an idea of who you're looking at, because there'll be pieces that you can kind of composite together of various pests. Any other questions before I keep chugging along? Yellow or blue? Excellent question. It's like, it's the extension hive mind right here. So when you're talking about the color choice, there are blue ones and there are yellow ones. If you can only budget for one color, go with yellow because it catches more things. Aphids, whiteflies, spider mites, thrips are all attracted to yellow. Blue is very good for thrips. If you historically deal with a thrips problem, then you want to maybe go with blue because they do like it better. But if you can get both, pair them up and you'll get everything basically. You don't just want one sticky card at the door. I usually advertise to people to put one at the door, at the other end of the tunnel, and at least one in the middle, and then check them on an every other weekly basis. There are other recommendations online for 1 to 2 for every 1,000 feet of square feet of space. So you want to space them out, check them on a regular basis, and bring them in. Do watch out for your fingers. It is extremely sticky, and you will get stuck to it as well. The weirdest thing I have ever seen stuck to a sticky card is a vole, I think it was. The card fell to the ground, and then the vole got stuck on there. I had an undergrad work for me last summer, and I think he got a little traumatized by some of the bycatch and was like, there are bird feathers on this one, but no bird. And I was like, yeah, that'll happen. They think they can get the bugs off of there. He didn't like that very much. The other thing to do if you aren't intrigued by the idea of sticky cards is to consider trap crops. There are trap crop lists out there. Trap crops are cheap. Trap crops are disposable, and you don't plan to sell them, but they're highly attractive to pests. So things like beans and marigolds, you can put these in between the plants that you're actually growing, and the pests will go to them first. And once you start seeing damage or you start seeing the pests, you can also centralize some of your monitoring to just the trap crops. You'll know that you need to watch the plants near there and start to treat them possibly, or you need to get rid of the trap crop and then you've cut the pest problem out. That is one option, is just to sanitize them away. The other thing that I will point out about monitoring is it doesn't count if you don't write it down. Just saying, oh, I'll remember when this happened next year, I can keep track of this. That's not a great method. There are apps for writing down tracking of your monitoring. There are forms online if you just look for IPM monitoring form. It'll help you to write things down, tell you what you see on the sticky cards, tell you what you're seeing when you're monitoring by hand. Try to make a consistent monitoring team. I'm guessing for a lot of you, that might be just yourself, but if you have other people that work with you, maybe pick one to be the monitor, because you want some samples that are repetitive. You want them to be similar week to week or month to month. You don't want to have Bob, who wears bifocals and maybe doesn't get down on his hands and knees, and then have Jerry, who is young and spry, but like runs through the tunnel because he's got a million other things to do. You can't compare their monitoring. They're two different types of sampling, so you want a consistency. Think about that when you're planning for your monitoring. Then that brings us to the thresholds. So when you're monitoring, what is the point of the monitoring of all this action that I've been talking about? We're trying to prevent the pests from reaching the economic threshold. The economic threshold is a mathematically calculated point in the population where it behooves us to treat that population in some fashion, to control them. The reason that we want to do this is we don't want them to reach the economic injury level, which is the lowest population of the pest that causes damage. But we don't want to get to that, obviously, because you're losing money from damage from the pest. But if you treat the pest before you reach the economic the threshold that I mentioned before, then you're wasting money. You're putting money out there and treating that you don't need. And so we have to be very precise in this timing. We do have charts for these that get made for different pests. There's the threshold. The threshold is crossed in our monitoring, and then we treat, and then hopefully never reach the economic injury level. Without that suppression, we're not going to get that control, and the population will keep growing. I love economic thresholds. I'm not a huge math guy, but I do like that we have this kind of research that's gone on. There are other things to think about with this. One is that there is a general equilibrium position, that there are pests there always, and that they're always kind of going up and down. Without a lot of environmental change, you're going to see something there. I could go out right now in somebody's yard and I could find 10 white grubs very easily if I dug down far enough. That doesn't mean they need to treat their yard though. It means that there's just bugs and that their yard isn't a radioactive wasteland. It just is something that lives there. But we have to keep that in mind. Otherwise, sometimes people act without needing to because they'll see just some pests, some bugs, but they don't realize that they're being kept in check. This is not going to be as common, of course, in a high tunnel, which is a more unnatural setting, and there are fewer natural enemies in the first place. So we do have to worry more about acting on what we call action thresholds. Action thresholds in some industries are called aesthetic thresholds. It's this idea that you can't suffer any damage. So if you've ever watched golf on TV, they work on aesthetic thresholds because the Masters, you can't have grass that's dead. You can't have one single dead blade of grass. In most cases, we try to steer people away from these because it is more pesticide expenditure. But unfortunately for your world, a lot of those economic thresholds are built on the idea that you'll be doing conventional agriculture when you go to treat it. So there aren't great economic thresholds for organic control. There's people that are working on it, but it is something for you to think about maybe going a little earlier than whatever economic thresholds you find online. That is the big complication with organic. You want to think about how to get in there and stop those pests from growing further. And I would encourage you that once you start picking them up in your monitoring, whatever your preferred strategy is, to try and implement some suppression pretty quickly after that. So suppression includes all of those other things that we talked about earlier, physical and mechanical control. The mechanical is lost, it's L, it looks like. Biological control, oh no, it just got moved down. Okay, chemical control, all of these are the tools that we use to kind of help win the battle, so to speak. And when we look at these, I think these are pretty classic. Most people can conceptualize them, but I do want to talk about some of them in more detail. And the first is physical control. So physical control is this idea that we can prevent pests from entering an area, or that we can disrupt their dispersal, their survival, or their reproduction. A big strategy that involves physical control is a row cover, putting something over the top of the plant. I would argue the tunnel itself is kind of a giant metal row cover, metal and plastic row cover, but you could have more row covers that you can put down. Fans are a form of physical control. It pushes the pests back out when they try to fly in, or it cuts down on moisture in the air by moving some of that wet air out, so you can cut down on pathogens perhaps. These are just going to be helpful in preventing those pests from getting in. Then we have mechanical control, which is much more spectacular. That's a very passive way of going about it. Mechanical control involves physically destroying the pest in some fashion. These can be as spectacular as flamethrowers. I've found a lot of videos of this. I didn't bring any plans for flamethrowers because I'm pretty sure that's domestic terrorism, but you can find them online if you would like. There's one for Colorado potato beetle, actually. If you ever deal with those, there is a flamethrower that you can build that involves propane, and the way that you build it, apparently it just sort of singes the plant, but it burns those larvae off and kills them. The potato is hardier than the potato beetle, apparently. Other physical methods include things like weed whackers or other physical sort of destruction tools. And then the big one that people sometimes avoid and sometimes are more willing to embrace is actually just putting them in soapy water. I know that that's really hard to do in a field, but in a high tunnel, you have a much more concentrated space. This is one of the most relaxing activities for an entomologist. You just walk along by rose bushes and things, and you tap Japanese beetles into soapy water. They float to the bottom. It has to be soapy because otherwise they just are like, this is relaxing, thank you very much. But if the soap is in there, it helps to destroy them. It helps to kill them. So get some soapy water in a pan, a bucket, a 5-gallon bucket, and just tap the pests in there and they will die. It is an effective strategy. Soapy water works quite well on pests in a variety of ways. If you've ever got like clustering stink bugs on your home, if you just get a hand pump sprayer and put Dawn and water in there, you can spray them when they're hanging out on the outside of your house, and it will kill all the ones that you contact. That is sort of the rub, though, of course, is that there's no residue left behind. You have to be there doing it. But it is very effective as a form of mechanical control. Then we get into other things like biological control. Very appealing option for folks such as yourselves. Do you want to use the good bugs against the bad bugs in these instances? This is just a smattering of companies that I came across in a quick Google search that do sell biocontrol agents. I've worked with Rincon Ventova quite a bit. They have a very robust customer service system. Arbico is usually the first one that pops up. Coper is up in Michigan. I don't remember where Nature's Control is, but that's a cool logo. That's hard to argue against there. Then we have Idlewild. This is actually a Kentucky organization. They have an insectarium where people can come and visit bugs, but they also sell biocontrol agents early in the growing season that you can purchase. They do have people usually that are helpful in terms of helping you figure out what you're dealing with and then what you need to buy in order to control them. Some of them are a little more robust than others. This is Rincon's sort of catalog on their website. In my example here, say you're dealing with a spider mite problem, you would go to the catalog, you would click on the spider mite link, mite controls there, and it would take you to a page that looks like this and tell you which beneficials are most likely to help you, and then we'll help you to see the price points. If you want to buy 1,000 in a bottle, that's $29. If you buy 10 plus bottles, it goes down to $13. So you do get a bulk buying discount if you can get your friends together and you all put your order in kind of around the same time. The price points for the bugs that you're buying themselves are usually pretty reasonable. It's the shipping that gets you. They have to ship them overnight and protected, and then that usually jacks the price up by double, but you will get live bugs that way. You don't want to order them and then have them show up a week later with the US Postal Service and you rattle the box and you can hear a bunch of dead ladybugs. That's nobody's idea of a good time. But if you do it through this, you will get them live the next day. There are some complications with biocontrol in the field where, okay, in that example, you buy ladybugs. I know they sell them on Amazon. I found them there before. You go, okay, I want 5,000 lady beetles. They ship them to you. The postal worker says, here you go. You go like, yeah, okay, and you run outside, you open the box. What's the first thing you're gonna do if you're a ladybug and you've been in a box for a day? Whoosh, fly up into the side and say, see ya, sucker, and go live somewhere else. We release a lot of lady beetles this way. But if you have a tunnel, of course, that's a little different. They're gonna be complicated in their escape plan, and some of them will definitely stick around. Others, if the windows or if the sides are open, they will crawl out, they will leave. They may not want to be there, but some of them will get stuck and stay behind. We can further sort of preserve our biocontrol purchases by not buying adults. Adult lady beetles and adult lacewings, they have wings. They can fly away. If you buy the immature versions, they eat the same things, but they can't get away as easily. So this is an immature lady beetle. How many of you have met one of these before? Awesome. I get a lot of people who bring me these from their trees, and they're like, this thing is eating my tree. And I get very sad because they've already killed it, but they're just like bragging to me about it at that point. When we have these, they eat about 5,000 aphids in their life, in between being a larva and adult, and you get them to stick around longer. We can also go with smaller biocontrol agents, using predatory mites to control lots of the younger stages of things like aphids and thrips. The mites, once you put them on a plant, that becomes their whole universe, basically. They're not going to be as easily spread off of those plants. So think about getting them younger if you're going to be doing this. So some examples that have worked in high tunnels before would include things like purchasing this mite to control spider mites. So here we have Phytocelius persimilis. You can call them Percy, maybe, for short, but they're feeding on those spider mites. Their populations will go up, and the spider mite populations will go down, and they aren't going to escape as easily because there's food there, and they're not big enough to run away. Mites can also help with thrips. So we have Amblyopsis swirsky, then Cucumaris, and then Hypoaspis miles. That one's down in the soil. One thing with predatory mites is that you have to put out alternative food for them as well. They like to eat a little bit of pollen. So if with these companies that sell the agents, if you can ask them where you could get pollen or if they sell it, Arbico does usually have it on their website. You just sprinkle the pollen around where you're putting the mites out. These companies provide very thorough directions on where to put the sachets of mites and where to sort of dribble them out, if that's the method that they have for it. And then you put the pollen nearby, and hopefully they'll have enough of everything that they want to feed, and it'll make them more successful. In terms of aphid problems, lady beetles are usually the go-to. Lady beetles devour aphids. This one is going to town on that one. People love the lady beetles, they're my daughter's favorite bugs, and we go out and we collect them a lot. But really, this is what you're dealing with. Like this is a hyper predator here, and they're just mowing through pest populations. They are not these peaceful, cute things. Like you see lady beetles, they're like, oh yeah, like hearts and unicorns and stuff. They're mega predators. Here is a little GIF of one actually eating. Like, look at that. Very satisfying for you all, right? To see, just slurps that aphid up like a rotini noodle. It's amazing. On the other side here, we have a lacewing larva. Lacewings are predators as immatures and as adults. When they're small like this, they're called aphid lions. They have these large sickle-shaped mouth parts, and they will go through and pick scales and aphids and mealybugs up with those mouth parts and feed on them. And then as adults, they can also feed on some of these pest populations. And then we have parasitoids. Oh, yes? Yes. So the question was how they source the lady beetles. Unfortunately, there have been a lot of these companies. They hire individuals to go out and scoop them up in their overwintering habitat in places like California and Arizona. Those companies I mentioned before, the insectaries, they're rearing theirs. So they have colonies of them, but they run out by about the middle of, I think, July or August. Usually there's been shortages the last couple of years. So if you go with these bigger insectaries, you will avoid that problem of people basically stealing ladybugs from California and shipping them to Kentucky. So go with an insectary, and that way you can cut down on that. Other options include parasitoids. So parasitoids lay their eggs inside of hosts. Here is a wasp that's injecting her eggs into the baby aphid here. As the aphid grows, the egg will grow, and then the wasp will develop inside of it. They use it as a nursery, basically. These puffed up aphids are called aphid mummies. They've been killed by the parasitoid. The adult chews this porthole in the rear end of the aphid and pops out, and then they fly off and they do it again. These are very helpful in high tunnels. They naturally occur, they fly in and find the aphids, but you can also purchase them if need be. Then we can talk about true parasites. So parasitoid sounds a lot like parasite, but parasitoids, they always kill their host. Parasites don't always kill their host, but we have some on the market that do kill hosts, and those are the ones that we sell. So this is Natural. This is a BT product formulated specifically for flies. It kills maggots. You treat the soil with it, and it will go in and kill those fungus gnat larvae that we talked about before. In the field, this is sold as those mosquito dunks, and we put it into rivers and streams, and it kills the mosquito larvae. They're also flies. We can also talk about things like nematodes. Nematodes can be pests, but there are others that are predatory or parasitic. These ones have squirmed their way into an immature fungus gnat, and they've killed it, eaten it alive, and now you have one less pest to deal with. These are for sale. There are some stipulations with them. They don't like UV light, so sometimes we spray them at night, and you have to water afterwards to get them down into the soil. Beyond that, we have things like Bavaria bassiana. Bavaria is a fungus that infects a lot of different pests, including mites, but it also works really well on thrips. So here you see one that's been completely mummified by Bavaria. How many of you have been watching that new show, The Last of Us, with the fungus that takes over the people and kills them? This is sort of similar to that, except it's tiny and we like it and it doesn't cause the apocalypse. So with this, you just spray the Bavaria out and then it will infest the pests and kill them. It is fairly effective as a biological control agent and as an organic option. If you want to learn more about biocontrol in high tunnels, we have IntFact 327 from the University of Kentucky and Kentucky State Extension Service. This was produced by John O'Bricky and Rick Besson, and it goes through lists of where to buy some of these and how to pair them with specific pest problems. This is one that we'll be updating here soon, but it still provides really, really good information from two excellent professors. And then we can talk about chemical suppression. So with chemicals, obviously that's a very different conversation for you all. Did you have your hand up? Right. Do you have those growing in the tunnel or around the outside of the tunnel? In the tunnel. Okay, is it okay if I re-say some of what you said for the recording? Okay, so we had a comment about purchasing biological control agents and then having them successfully established within the tunnel through the use of beneficial plants that are in the area. We had dill, what was it called, mammoth dill? Mammoth dill that was planted, spaced out appropriately, recruits parasitic wasps, as well as, what was the other one you said? Lacewings into the tunnel, and also has allowed for the establishment of some of these biocontrol agents that are purchased. There are multiple types of biocontrol. I didn't get into that today, but we have augmentation, which is what we do when we buy these things and then release them. And then we have conservation biocontrol, which is what this gentleman is talking about, this idea that you change the area a little bit so that these beneficial organisms can survive better and are recruited to the area. And he's kind of merged the two, which is very good. And another benefit of doing biocontrol in high tunnels, actually, is it allows you to do that a little bit better. There is a kind of higher upfront cost with biocontrol, but if you can get them to establish and maintain, as he described, then in the long run, you have a reduction in costs. So it's an excellent point to bring up, and I appreciate it. Thank you. The final thing I wanted to talk about were the chemicals. Your list as organic producers is, of course, shorter, but these are some of the high points that I would say exist for high tunnels with insecticides: spinosad, insecticidal soap, neem, and then pyrethrin. Spinosad and neem are products that work against quite a range of things. Insecticidal soap is not like dish soap I was advocating for earlier. It is slightly different, but works. With all of these, you do have to be very careful in the tunnel that you're not putting it on usually above 90 degrees. Neem and soap and spinosad have oils in them that can sometimes burn the plant if it's too warm around it. Pyrethrin is a natural version of the pyrethroids that get used in conventional agriculture more frequently. So it's what we based the pyrethroids on. We made modifications in the lab that makes it last longer. Pyrethrin itself comes from the chrysanthemum. With this, the product can stick around for up to a week, just about, depending on the temperature and the weather. But you do get control of things like caterpillars, aphids, mites, thrips, and leafhoppers in the tunnel. I saw lots of people taking pictures of this one, so hopefully that's helpful in the future. If you ever have any questions on this, I am available to help. I can be reached through email, jonathan.larson@uky.edu. You can also contact your local extension agent, and they can get a hold of me. They've got my number. If you're on Twitter, I'm @BugmanJohn there, and I take samples through there until, I guess, Elon Musk destroys the platform or whatever is going to happen next. But I do like to take pictures on there and help people figure out what they're dealing with. And are there any questions I can answer right now? Got one in the back. What do I think of black and yellow garden spiders? I think they're awesome. My mom cross-stitched me one, and I got it hanging in my office. I thought that was pretty cool. So they are large spiders, very imposing looking. They're not something that we can really release necessarily, but they are something that if you get them in the area, they do help to suppress pests. They build large orb webs that have kind of a zipper down the middle. We call that the stabilimentum. We used to think it was there to make the web stronger, but now we actually think it's to advertise to birds that the web is there so they don't fly into it. So you can notice them very easily, and they do provide sort of free pest control. In the back.
Yeah, is there any control you know of organically that works well on scale insects?
Scale insects?
They just seem like really difficult to...
So if you are monitoring, the question was about scales and organic methods. If you're monitoring for them, usually with a black electrical tape wrapped around a plant, sticky side out, their crawlers will get stuck in the tape, and you will be able to find them in the tape if you're checking regularly, and then you treat the crawlers with neem or with an insecticidal soap. It will kill them, but as soon as they settle down and plug their mouth in, they start covering themselves up, sometimes with a waxy armor. Then the window has been missed, and then your best bet is going to be physical or mechanical control, scrubbing them off usually. But that's a tall order for a lot of plant owners.
Hey, you had an interesting comment about the farmer that had the annual Kentucky bluegrass that was kind of being a reservoir for the aphids.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts about using beneficials and trying to create reservoirs for them to persist from year to year?
I do have thoughts on that. I think if you can maintain plants, as this gentleman described earlier, the dill that he has growing there, that would allow you to have some pests living there, and then also have some biocontrol agents that are feeding on them as well. And then maybe expand from there and feed on the pests that invade later. It is a possibility, yes.
Our tunnels?
Yeah, go for it.
Anise hyssop. It's a purple flowered plant. Beneficials are like swarm it. It's incredible.
We put that out for Operation Pollinator a few years ago. We were taking parts of golf courses and changing them over to hyssop and coneflower, all kinds of stuff to increase pollinators there.
Yeah, it's been like our #1.
Okay, so we've got the mammoth dill and hyssop now mentioned each. Yes, sir. HYSSOP, I think. I didn't know it was a spelling bee today. I didn't prepare. Yes.
Yeah, really nice presentation. I just had 2 comments. In my commercial high tunnel, one thing I've noticed is that one certain species of tree that I was growing in there just seemed to be like a magnet for whiteflies. And so I actually, and these are containerized plants.
Right.
And I actually just started growing it outside because instead of fighting the pest in there, I just started growing it outside in pots, on irrigation, everything, and then the problem just disappeared, you know?
Yeah. You would say maybe you prevented it, if I could tie it into my talk?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And one organic product that has been really effective for us in the high tunnel production is called Zero Tolerance.
Okay.
And I think it was originally like a cannabis product, but it's can be used on any kind of plant, of course.
Okay.
And it's different essential oils. Clove is one of them. It has some others in there, but it just seems really effective for like white flies and mites and things. So that's a product that we really like to use.
Excellent. I appreciate that. That is anecdotal, obviously, but I know that lots of people are looking into those essential oils right now. Like that's the hot topic in organic insecticide research, is figuring out if we can start publishing more on that, and then hopefully getting the word out more about it. So thank you for sharing. Yes, sir.
Mr. versus sprayer.
Mr. versus sprayer. Sprayer, I would say. Misters, I actually, that's very interesting that you brought that up. I had a rash of calls about that this past late summer. It seemed like maybe there were some folks going around and selling them. I'm not going to say that that's bad or whatever, but there's only really one product I think that you can put into a mister. It is organic, technically, the pyrethrin, so it would be an option for you. It does get the residues where you need them to be. Am I getting pulled off the stage? Is that okay? Okay. It gets the residues where you need them to be in things. But if you're conventional, I was saying not to do it. But if you are organic, it is something that would deliver the pyrethrin in a way that would be very beneficial to you. Does that am I answering your question? Okay. I don't remember neem having Mr. on its label when I looked at the last time. Yes, ma'am.
What are your thoughts on soil soaking, particularly you can buy a concentrated form of neem and you actually water the plant with it, and
Okay.
the plant
Systemic
supposedly
neem?
absorbs it, and then when the bugs eat on the plant, it supposedly kills them. Do you
I
think
w-
that works?
I would have to look into that more to speak with any authority of it. I haven't heard of systemic neem treatments before. I like the idea. I would want to see some efficacy data for that for sure. Sort of stealing the thunder from the neonicotinoids, right, and returning it to the organic. That would be great. But in my experience, neem is only a contact product, not systemic. Okay.
What's your thoughts about Castile soap?
I don't have any thoughts on that. I'd have to look into that. I apologize. I don't know that one. Can you tell me a little bit more about it, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a like an old family remedy.
Okay.
My great grandfather used to actually use it on his crops, and I've been using it in my greenhouses, and it like tears spider mites apart.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, but I've been trying to look into it more to see if it's really okay for the plant. I
Okay.
mean, none of my plants died or anything.
Right.
So,
That's a vote of confidence. My extension colleague here, Alexa Sheffield, she was saying something about it. Have you experience with it?
I think it works as a suffocant, the way like a Dawn dish soap or an insecticidal soap works, where it covers the insect. So as long as you're getting it on the insect body itself and it's a soft-bodied insect, it will take care of it. Sorry, to steal your.
Oh, that's perfect. We're a team. Yes. Oh, we gotta wait for the microphone.
Can you speak to the scenario where you would pull some, say you had some one-cut lettuce that you harvested and you've got some aphids, and you take those and put them in the compost pile and they go through the composting process? Can you speak to their possible persistence or not? When reapplying the compost is finished and ready?
So my guess would be that they would leave well before you would be ready to use the compost. Aphids, they're not going to stick around on plant material that's not thriving, so they're going to walk away and go feed on something else. If they are at the winged stage, they may fly and go somewhere else, but they're not going to go through the composting process. They'll be gone before that. Any other questions? One more, I'm told, before I am kicked out.
I'm curious about tobacco. Tobacco, supposedly the plants absorb it. You can't even eat it for like 3 or 4 days because that'll make you sick. But
Right.
I don't hear anything about that, but it seems like it'd be a pretty potent
Yes.
insecticide.
Nicotine is a pesticide. Nicotine was evolved by plants to protect themselves from insects. It works on their central nervous system. The neonicotinoids are based off of nicotine, and so it plays havoc with their synapses basically and causes paralysis. The pleasant feeling that we get from nicotine is a sort of miniaturized version of that. If you were the size of a bug, it wouldn't be cool to smoke a cigarette, for sure. So in the past, nicotine was extracted from tobacco plants and used as an insecticide. If you go far enough back in time, you would see native peoples using it actually in that fashion. So it is something. I don't know of anybody that sells it right now, and I don't really know, what's that? It's not organic. Okay, never mind, you can't do it. You can't. I can. I'm not organic. That was the last one, right? Well, thank you for your comments and your questions. I appreciate hearing those. Have a good rest of the conference.